What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that helps investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens get an edge by equipping themselves with the knowledge needed to anticipate the challenges and opportunities of tomorrow. By sharing my critical thinking approach and by challenging consensus narratives about the power structures shaping our world, I help you make the connections to see the bigger picture, empowering you to make smarter decisions. On this week's episode, I speak with historian Niall Ferguson about his latest book, Doom: The Politics of Catastrophe. The book explores some of history's most epic disasters, ranging from pandemics to botched military responses to nuclear accidents. What they all share in common is a striking combination of operator and managerial error, resulting from systemic problems that become catastrophic in the face of predictable, though unimaginable crises. While the book is mainly a history of disaster, its lessons apply most urgently today, in our own time, which means that this was also an opportunity for me to explore some of the contemporary challenges that we face in Western society, including the commencement of a new Cold War and what it means for economic and national security, COVID-19 and future pandemics, and the transformation and health of financial markets, digital assets, and the economy in the face of a potential breakout of consumer and producer prices to heights not seen in almost 50 years. This conversation is meant to expose you to some of these deeper, systemic forces that have been building in our society and which turn otherwise predictable events into inconceivable catastrophes. Is COVID-19 one of them? Possibly. Though if it isn't, our obsession over it, our obsession over the infection rates, case fatality numbers, and vaccine rollouts may be distracting us from the larger, more imminent challenge that is materializing right before our eyes, and which could change our lives in ways that few people alive today have ever experienced. That challenge is one we explore in depth during today's episode. So without any further ado, please enjoy this phenomenal conversation with my guest, historian and author, Niall Ferguson. Niall Ferguson, welcome to Hidden Forces.
My pleasure.
It's great having you on. I've been reading your work and your books since either right out of college or during college. I read Colossus. I can't remember when it was.
It probably went down badly with your professor if you mentioned my name.
I don't know if it was part of the reading list or if I was reading it separately.
Probably not, and you were wise to keep it quiet. I think I was already becoming an unpopular figure amongst many professors.
That's interesting. Well, that's usually a badge of honor. So you're out with your 17th book now, I think. Is that right?
I've stopped counting.
I think it is. You publish so many books that your bio is perpetually out of sync with how many books you've published. So it says 16. I think it's 17. The book is called Doom: The Politics of Catastrophe. Where did the idea for this book come from? And how much of it was percolating in your head before the onset of the pandemic, and how much of it was inspired by the events of 2020?
Well, the obvious inference that a casual reader would draw is that this was inspired by the COVID-19 pandemic, but that wouldn't be quite true because, in fact, I was, through 2019, thinking a lot about the history of the future as written in science fiction, and in particular dystopian catastrophic futures. I'd come to the conclusion that thinking exclusively about history and trying to understand the present had a kind of Achilles heel as a method. And the Achilles heel is that it's very difficult to think about technological change using only history. And so I started reading science fiction again in 2019 with a view to writing something about that. And indeed, I did write an essay about that, which didn't get published because then the pandemic came along. And pretty quickly in the course of the first couple of months of 2020, I realized that this had to form part of a larger project, not on the history of pandemics, that was too obvious, but on the history of disasters and dystopias generally. So I had actually been mulling this over, and in many ways reading all that science fiction, which I hadn't really done for years. I mean, I'd kind of stopped reading science fiction in my late teens, meant that I was thinking a lot about pandemics, because a lot of science fiction is about pandemics. Perhaps it helped kind of get my antennae into the right shape for seeing what was coming, or at least spotting it early.
So why doom, if I may ask? And I think I mentioned the subtitle of the book is The Politics of Catastrophe. Why did you choose to focus on the sociological and political dimensions of catastrophes and not the actual events themselves?
Well, the book, of course, looks at the events themselves, but one of the points I tried to make early on is that the distinction we tend to draw between natural and man-made disasters is kind of an artificial one. Sure, there's a difference between a pandemic and a war in that it's a novel pathogen that causes a pandemic, and it's human beings, usually men, who start wars. But when you take a step back and ask yourself, what do we really mean by disaster? The answer is that we mean excess mortality, people dying prematurely who should have lived longer. And if you look at what happened when this pandemic began, it wasn't inevitable that 500,000 Americans would die. The total number of people who've died of COVID in Taiwan is 11, and Taiwan is right next to where this began. So what I tried to show is that ultimately, even the natural disasters are politically mediated. Same goes for a geological disaster like a massive volcanic eruption. If a volcanic eruption happens on an uninhabited island, it's not really that big a disaster. But if it happens in a very densely populated part of the world, then it is. But it's human beings who choose or have chosen historically to build cities near very geologically dangerous places. So even the natural disasters have a kind of political dimension to them. And I wanted to try and make an argument that linked together all the different forms of disaster, because in some ways history is really one damn disaster after another. That's actually what historians mostly study, not always, but mostly. And we don't have a particularly good framework for thinking about disaster. Instead, we kind of subdivide it into silos. So some people look at wars, and some people look at great financial disasters, and some people look at public health disasters. And I wanted to show that, in fact, there are some common features to all disasters, regardless of whether we think of them as natural or man-made.
Well, one of the things I thought was interesting about the book was that you pointed out that we oftentimes tell ourselves stories or seek to explain disasters by pointing at leadership, at certain personalities, but that it's ultimately deeper systemic problems that turn what are normally predictable disasters into unimaginable catastrophes. So in the book, you talk about both the 1918 and the 1957 flu. You talk about nuclear disasters, the sinking of the Titanic. What do all of these different disasters have in common? And then I'd like to bring that to talk about not just COVID-19, but really the perhaps bigger looming dangers that sit before us.
Well, I think that the temptation in any disaster is to blame the person at the top. And it's true that the buck stops at the president's desk, as Harry Truman famously acknowledged. There is responsibility that comes with power. But it's a little too easy to say we had a disastrous pandemic because Donald Trump was a terrible president, which a lot of people argued last year. I kind of lost track of the number of articles that essentially made this argument, implying that it would have been much better if someone else had been president. I think there's a need to look a little bit more deeply to understand what went wrong in the United States. Sure, Trump got a great many things wrong, and I make it clear in the book what those were. But the thing that caused the United States to do much worse than Taiwan wasn't so much presidential misinformation or disinformation. It was the fact that CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, totally failed to make testing widely available early on. So we had no clue who was infected right into March and beyond. The testing failure can't really be blamed on Trump. That was a failure of the public health bureaucracy. We also failed to build the kind of contact tracing systems that they built in countries such as Taiwan and South Korea. That wasn't for lack of technology. The big tech companies in the US could have done this, but it wasn't Trump who said, don't do it. They decided not to do it. Apple and Google certainly could have done it, but they, for reasons best known to themselves, made no real serious effort to make contact tracing work at the national level. And so I think when you look at the reasons that Taiwan did much better than the United States, you begin to see that our public health bureaucracy failed pretty massively at the key things it could have done, and other countries did do. This is not to defend Trump. I think Trump was time and again wildly off target and often did harmful things. But I think we will be making a grave error if we conclude that if we'd only had a different president, we would have done far better. I don't think that's right. And actually, just a couple of years ago, before COVID, Ron Klain, who's now Joe Biden's chief of staff and was his chief of staff when he was vice president, acknowledged that if in 2009 the swine flu virus had been as deadly as COVID, then it probably would have been about as big a disaster, despite the fact that Barack Obama was president. So I'm really keen in this book to show that disasters don't necessarily emanate from the top. They can, in fact, come from failures of middle management. And I'll have to acknowledge where I got this idea from, because it didn't come from me. It came from the physicist Richard Feynman's brilliant book about the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, which is a wonderful read as he shows that initially when the Challenger blew up, there was a kind of attempt by the media to say it was somehow Ronald Reagan's fault. But it turned out not to be anything to do with the White House. And as Feynman delved into what had actually happened at NASA, what he discovered was that the engineers at NASA had known there was a significant risk, like a 1 in 100 risk, that the space shuttle would blow up because of fuel leakages. But the bureaucrats at NASA had kind of massaged this into a much, much lower probability, more like 1 in 100,000. And that was the point of failure. So I try to argue in Doom that the point of failure often is not at the top. Yeah, responsibility does belong there, and nobody is saying that Trump did a good job, he did a bad job. But the real problems would probably have manifested themselves whoever was president, because they lay in this kind of middle management bureaucracy area.
Do you feel like we tend to obsess and catastrophize over the latest disaster or thing at the expense of future risks, let's say? Because I think one of the things that has come out of this crisis for me has been an overreaction. And when I say overreaction, I mean very specifically the way in which people, the narratives that people spin and tell themselves and are told through the media about what this virus is, how dangerous it is, what they have to do to change their lives, and the sort of lack of emotional resilience around it.
It's a very dangerous thing to criticize the media, especially if you've just published or are about to publish a book. I don't think, nevertheless, that the media did a great job in their coverage, because they began, if you look back at January, February coverage, by downplaying the risk. There was a lot of commentary along the lines of, it's no worse than the seasonal flu, and Trump is a racist for wanting to restrict travel from China. And then we swung in March to a kind of apocalyptic view that we were all in the movie Contagion and we had to shut everything down, which I think was an overreaction. That's not to say we should have done nothing, because I think that's definitely not a plausible argument. If we'd done absolutely nothing, then probably 1 million Americans would have died, maybe more. Nobody can really say. But much that we did was actually scientifically clueless. A good example would be the closure of beaches and parks. Now, it was already pretty clear from Chinese data back in February that this new disease did not spread outdoors, that it was almost all indoor transmission. And yet public health authorities, including in California where I live, were shutting down the places that people would have been best off spending time. And that kind of thing did a lot, I think, to undermine public confidence in the guidance that was given. Think also of the messaging on masks, which went from, you don't need to get a mask because they were terrified of running out in public health in hospitals to, you've got to wear 3 masks all the time, including when you're outdoors. So I do think that the combination of media, not overreaction, but swinging from complacency to hysteria and very mixed public health messaging contributed to a certain crisis of confidence. Ordinary people, it turns out, adapted their behavior in the early stages of the pandemic quite rationally. So even before shelter-in-place orders were issued in California, which is where they were issued first, people were traveling around less. There was a distinct drop in mobility to leisure and retail destinations. So people kind of knew that it was time to stay home. But then they were kind of hit with a whole bunch of additional regulations, only some of which made sense. Clearly, there were certain occupations that were suddenly to be discontinued. You didn't want crowded restaurants and bars. But a lot of manufacturing really was able to function quite well during the pandemic, and shutting it down magnified the economic shock more than was necessary. And I'm pretty sure when we finally do a full cost-benefit analysis of what we broadly call lockdowns, we'll find that there really were some very significant costs. I'll throw out just one. The way that public schools were closed and remained closed for a very long time seems to me to be a highly questionable policy measure, not least because a great many private schools proved that you could in fact function. Children were not principally in the line of fire for this disease, and children didn't spread it, particularly young children, very much either, so far as we can see. And so it seems likely that that was one of those policy decisions that didn't really have a net benefit. So I think looking at the countries that got this right, and I've mentioned Taiwan before, you can see that we did an awful lot more than was probably necessary to limit the excess mortality. And we actually omitted to do the things that would really have worked.
Well, I think one of the problems is that we don't properly take into account the trade-offs,
right,
and the costs associated with action, because the political costs of inaction are so high.
Yeah, I think there was a kind of naive trade-off. There was this kind of view in some states, well, we should just not do any of this because we have to keep the economy going, and some excess mortality is a price worth paying. And at the other extreme, you had the blue states that were closing the parks and the beaches. The truth is that there was a middle ground that could have been, I think, much more effectively spelt out if more careful attention had been paid to the research that was coming out of China and then out of Europe. Remember, COVID came relatively late to the United States, and I was still arguing with people in February that there was a major problem coming and we weren't doing enough. And it wasn't until mid-March that the penny dropped with key decision makers that this was a very serious pandemic indeed. But yeah, I think the history of disasters is worth looking at, because in 1957, a comparably dangerous pandemic came from Asia. It was an influenza, a new strain of influenza that it was. And although it was not as disastrous in the United States, it was very similar in terms of its global impact. We're still roughly at the same place in terms of the percentage of people who died. I think in the end, COVID is going to exceed the 57, 58 death toll, but it's only just kind of getting there now. And in the US, the response to that novel virus was completely different from the response we've had today. There were no school closures, no lockdowns. There wasn't even a state of emergency. There was a lot of illness. There was a lot of death, though not as much as we've seen in the last year and a half. And there's zero economic impact. You can't actually pick up the impact of the pandemic in the economic data. What they did then was to focus on getting a vaccine as fast as possible, and they succeeded in doing that. Now, we couldn't have done that in 2020 because I think that would have led to an intolerably large number of deaths in the United States. But you can't help but be struck by the radically different response of our leadership and of society as a whole to the threat. People just accepted in 1957 that there was a risk of contagious disease. nor did they have the option to shut the economy down because working from home really wasn't an option for most people in 1957. One of the interesting things about the lockdown is that it's only recently that it became possible for so many of us to work from home because of the internet. So that wasn't an option in 57, and it wasn't an option in 1918, which, by the way, was a far, far worse pandemic, that probably 40 times worse in terms of its impact on mortality.
Well, they were still dealing with polio and other diseases at that time. They had just been through 2 world wars back to back. I mean, you're talking about a generation that had a very different perspective when it came to death and expectations around life and living without suffering.
That's right.
I mentioned early on that we tend to obsess over the latest thing, the latest crisis. That's not something that you did with this book. And listeners of this show will be pleasantly surprised to learn that you devoted quite a bit of time to discussing the geopolitical challenges and this emerging new Cold War between the United States, its allies. Again, that somewhat remains to be seen how the new alliance will come together on the Western side, and an emerging alliance as well of more authoritarian countries. And one of the things that we've been seeing in the last year in particular is closer and closer ties between Russia and China. You quoted Henry Kissinger in the book. You've written, I think, one part of a biography, a 2-part biography of Henry Kissinger.
That's right.
And you said that Kissinger told you that we are in the, quote, foothills of a new Cold War. Is that how you feel as well? And what does that mean?
Yes, Kissinger said that to me in late 2019. The reason that I talk about Cold War II is not only that I think we're in it, but also because war is as catastrophic, or can be as catastrophic, as a pandemic. And if you actually look back over the 20th century, that was as big a killer as infectious disease. So I think we need to take seriously the clear and present danger that US-Chinese relations could escalate, not only to Cold War, but even to hot war. People somewhat underestimate how catastrophic war could be because recent wars have been quite small. I mean, they've taken a lot of space in our media coverage, Iraq and Afghanistan, but by comparison with the world wars, they are very small conflicts indeed. A US-China war would be on a completely different scale. And what's fascinating is the way in which the pandemic caused US-China relations, which were already heading for Cold War, to deteriorate really markedly. And also China's relations with most democracies have got a lot worse. Not just because the pandemic originated in China, and not just because it obviously was mishandled at the beginning by the Chinese Communist Party, which sought to cover up the extent of the problem in December and January, but also because China subsequently tried rather, I think, clumsily to change the narrative by boastfully saying that it was going to offer vaccines to the world, vaccines that they produced, but they turn out not to be terribly good. And they also resorted to a kind of bullying wolf warrior diplomacy that alienated a great many people. So the US-China relationship, the West's relationship with China, got much worse in the course of the past year, so that we're no longer in the foothills of Cold War. I think we're properly in Cold War II, but rather as in the late 1940s, a lot of Americans are in denial about that. One striking thing about the origins of Cold War I was that although George Orwell first used the term Cold War in 1945 or 46, I think it was 45, it wasn't really until the war turned hot over Korea 5 years later that most Americans came round to the realization that they were in a fundamental conflict with the Soviet Union. And I think we're in the similar state of denial at the moment. A lot of people would love to avoid Cold War II. They would love to keep Chimerica going, a term I used to characterize the US-China economic relationship 10 or 15 years ago. But there's no way. There are too many points of collision, of conflict. And I think this past year has just intensified the rivalry, not only in ideological terms, but also in technological terms, because this is a technology race as well as an arms race, and in traditional geopolitical terms. you have obviously got the potential flashpoint already in the form of Taiwan. So to come back to your question, a lot of people would rather we focused on climate change as the next big threat to our existence, to the exclusion of other threats. And that was kind of going on before COVID struck. But I'm amazed at how quickly people want to get back to that conversation. Climate change certainly poses some serious risks. But part of the argument of doom is that that's only one of the many risks that we face. And if we only talk about climate change and think that that's the only thing we really need to worry about, then we will only have ourselves to blame when we find ourselves in World War III.
You know, reading this book, I had the distinct feeling that you and I share many common interests and read many of the same books, because the last two guests I had on the program were Stephen Koonin to talk about climate change and the science of climate change, and the other guest was Toby Ord.
Yes.
And the conversation was very much around prioritization, risk calculation, and where to focus our limited attention. You know, to the point that you made about war and the scale of war and our lack of familiarity with it, and with that type of scale, I would say actually the defining characteristic that differentiates the types of wars and conflicts that we've dealt with in the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st with what we may be on the cusp of is the sense of a war or a conflict being out of control. I think Americans have always felt that at the end of the day, if they simply want to walk away from a conflict, they can walk away. They're the ones pressing the action. Now, there is, of course, the Cold War could potentially be out of control, but we were never in a hot war since the end of World War II where it felt that the world could end. And given the type of technologies that exist today and the capacities for destruction and the newness of this conflict, and the fact that we're just beginning to wrap our arms around it, I think the risk of a miscalculation is steep.
Yeah.
So to that point, the first question I have, because I think this is the sort of one of the major challenges in building the political consensus in the United States to properly frame this issue, has to do with Americans and Westerners' lack of comprehension around how the Chinese political system operates and the sources of legitimacy or illegitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And Taiwan fits squarely into that bullseye. So what do most Westerners, in your estimation, not understand about modern China?
Well, first, Demetri, you're absolutely right. We would get to disaster much faster through great power conflict than through climate change. Because if you had a war between the United States and China, it would escalate extremely rapidly. And it would escalate into new domains where we haven't really seen great power conflict before, namely into cyberspace. And I think if one tries to imagine the war of the future, and Jim Stavridis has just done it in a new novel, but it's a novel rooted in military reality, the war of the future would be hugely disruptive to life in the United States in a way that no previous war has been, with the possible exception of the Civil War. Because a war with China would not just be waged in the seas around Taiwan. It would be waged in space, it would involve satellites, and it would be waged in cyberspace. And it could potentially hugely disrupt all that we now do on the back of the internet, including conversations like this. But think of the critical infrastructure that would be potentially disrupted by full-blown cyber war. So I think the war of the future is not going to be Iraq and Afghanistan, that's for sure. Now, the problem in the conversation that goes on in the United States about China is that a great many people are still taken in by the notion that China is only communist in name, but in reality it's capitalist. And this is an extremely plausible line of argument if all you've ever done is take a trip to Shanghai, wander around the bund marveling at the skyscrapers and come home, maybe stopping off in a shopping mall before you leave. And that kind of conference experience of China is hugely deceptive. Unlike the Soviet Union, the Chinese Communist Party has worked out how to have a market economy wrapped around the planned economy that is at the core. but they have not in any way sacrificed the party's total control over daily life and indeed the economy. And Xi Jinping has reasserted that control and used technology to create the most powerful surveillance state, and I'd say the most powerful totalitarian state of all time. So we have to stop kidding ourselves about the nature of the Chinese system. And we certainly have to kiss goodbye to the fantasy that if we engaged with China economically, it would somehow liberalize and become more democratic. A lot of policymakers bought into that idea, including some of those who are now in power in Washington. But in the last few years, the scales, I think, have largely fallen from their eyes. If you think of someone like Kurt Campbell, for example, or Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, however naive they may have been before, reality mugged them enough in recent years for them to take a much tougher line now. But the public is kind of lagging behind in some ways. Sure, I think sentiment towards China has become more negative, but it's still a stretch to persuade even well-educated Americans that China is ideologically and strategically as big a threat to the United States as the Soviet Union was, and bigger in the sense that it is economically a far more formidable opponent than the Soviet Union ever was.
Absolutely, and it has interlocking economic relationships across the world in a way that the Soviet system did not. You know, the recent pullout announcement by the Russians that they were pulling out of the International Space Station, I don't think got nearly enough press for its significance.
I think that's right. One of the things that really gets underplayed in our coverage of international relations is how closely Russia and China are joined these days. And that means that there is a much higher level of coordination between Beijing and Moscow than is appreciated, including conducting of joint military exercises, clearly some coordination in the disinformation, misinformation strategies that they both have pursued towards the United States and its democratic process. And space is a hugely important frontier. It's easy to mock the efforts of the Trump administration to give new institutional shape to US strategy in space. But in reality, space will be an absolutely key frontier in Cold War II, far more important than it was in Cold War I, though it started to really matter in Cold War I too, and helped end it because it was so clear that the Soviet Union could not stand up to what the Reagan administration threatened to do with so-called Star Wars. So I think we underestimate the scale of conflict that lies ahead. And we also need to recognize that if China and Russia are united, which historically they rarely have been, but united as they were in the late 1940s and early 1950s, except that now China's the senior partner, that is a very formidable coalition capable of attacking the US and its allies in multiple theaters. And we've known for some time that, great though the expenditure of the US is on defense, on national security, there's no way that it could easily cope with a multi-front conflict. This is the sort of three bodies of water problem, if you like, that the United States would really struggle if it found itself in confrontation simultaneously in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, in the Persian Gulf, and in the Atlantic. There's just no way that we have the capabilities to cope with that. And that's the nightmare scenario for any defense planner.
Well, I mean, listeners of this show know how often we've covered China. We had Chris Brose on the program, who was, among other things, the staff director for the Senate Armed Services Committee. And
for years, John McCain's advisor. I know Chris and very much admire his book, The Kill Chain. I think if you're paying attention, you can see what the war of the future will look like. Just as if you were paying attention in, let's say, 1910, you could see what the war of the future would look like. And yet, remarkably few people were paying attention in the years prior to 1914. And remarkably few understood what someone like Ivan Brosh was arguing, that the war of the future would be a kind of large-scale industrialized slaughterhouse, which would have potentially much greater duration than people anticipated. We have some pretty good blueprints for the war of the future. Chris Brose's is one of them. I mentioned Jim Stavridis' book. But are we paying attention? Not enough. But part of the problem, Demetri, is that we're not really teaching our young people to think about these issues. Remember, we're talking about concepts of power here, of military and technological conflict that are absent from the history that is taught in most American colleges and schools today. So focused has the educational establishment become on questions of social justice and racial equity that there's almost no serious study of warfare. And military history is essentially dying out, if it hasn't already died out, in major universities. And that's why this conversation is kind of vanishing onto podcasts and away from, and is absent on mainstream media, because people are no longer taught to think about these issues. They're no longer taught to think about the history of communist regimes. So they don't even have a good handle on what is happening in China.
Yeah, so many thoughts. I mean, the pre-1914 period is a good comparison. It's a scary comparison because while trench warfare caused a sort of a slowdown of warfare on the continent, the expectation by the German general staff at the time was that whoever struck first would have a decisive advantage in industrial warfare. And in the world we live in today, that time advantage has collapsed. And it's certainly in the case of cyber warfare, where weapons today exploits can become non-effective. And you don't know when that weapon will no longer be effective, and you're incentivized to move quickly.
That's
and
right.
Because also this is a new area of warfare and very few people have on-the-ground experience with it. I mean, the Russians certainly have a little bit in Ukraine. It's fertile for mistakes.
Yes.
One thing I want to ask you, and then please kind of run with it, and I'd love to get into Taiwan too, because we've also done an episode on possible invasion scenarios of the island. What do you think about the Biden administration's decision to pull out of Afghanistan? Not just because of the additional potential security issues that will cause within the Middle East and around terrorism potentially, but given the fact that Afghanistan, to my knowledge, is the only area in the world where the U.S. has a base in a geography that borders China.
Well, it's not surprising, is it, that this decision was taken? It's of a piece with the Obama administration's decision to exit Iraq without really leaving any meaningful and effective presence there. And that's turned out great, hasn't it? When you think about the mess that country is in and the general decline of the stability of the Middle East. So I don't find it surprising, because the political cost to the Obama administration of just walking away from Iraq was minimal domestically, even if the cost in terms of the stabilization of Iraq was very high. The US has been walking away from military messes since Vietnam and turning a blind eye to the consequences. And no doubt the Afghans who supported the US forces will pay a similar price to the South Vietnamese when they were left to their fate. That's all depressing and morally questionable, but your question is about the strategic wisdom of walking away. And I think it's absolutely key for the United States, given its escalating difficulties with China, to ensure that it does not have to wage a long-distance war in the event of a conflict. It will be hard enough, if there is a war over Taiwan, to maintain public support for it. But it will be logistically difficult to wage that war, which will be in China's backyard on the other side of the Pacific from us. So I feel as if this decision on Afghanistan is of a piece with the decision on Iraq. I was against that. I'm skeptical about the wisdom of this. And my sense is that we will come to regret allowing the Taliban to take Afghanistan back over. Whether the Taliban have any interest in supporting Beijing or not doesn't matter. The Taliban are hostile to the United States. And from that point of view, leaving Afghanistan to them not only writes off all the efforts that have been made over 20 years nearly, it also creates an obvious vulnerability in the event of conflict in Asia.
Yeah. So let's pivot to Taiwan. Do you expect the CCP and the PLA to invade the island and take it over before the end of the decade? And if
Yeah.
so, okay, so
They will try.
so how do we respond? And do we respond preemptively by switching from a stance of strategic ambiguity to one of clarity? Or are we going to continue along this path? And how do we respond in that context?
Well, I do think that they will try, because I think Xi Jinping has made it clear that his ultimate goal is to bring Taiwan back into the fold, and that is going to be the capstone of his time at the helm of the Communist Party. This will be his claim to historic parity with Mao Zedong. So they're going to try, and they'll try via invasion, I think, only when all the other options have been tried and failed, because it's risky. And it's not as if the PLA has a whole lot of rodeos of experience in actual fighting to be confident of victory. They would rather do this by stealthier means, but their efforts to undermine Taiwan through political methods failed. The election of January 2020 revealed really the bankruptcy of Beijing's soft power approach. That result was a complete defeat for Beijing. What are their alternatives? Well, they can quarantine the island. They can start to try to control access to and from Taiwan and make it difficult to do business there, make it hard for you to go to Taiwan and then be allowed into the PRC. That would be the kind of lightest option. Anything much above that, say blockade, is essentially going to be interpreted as an act of war. So I think the Chinese must worry that they could end up getting into a war over Taiwan prematurely. That's why they'll be cautious, especially this year. On the other hand, the United States has begun to talk a lot tougher about Taiwan in recent years, and there's a real continuity from the Trump administration to the Biden administration in this respect, a very striking one. I don't personally agree with Richard Haas that we somehow should junk the strategic ambiguity that has served us well since the time of Kissinger, because I don't think changing your language makes that much difference if you can't back up tough talk with military credibility. And right now, the problem the US has is that its commitment to Taiwan isn't just ambiguous, it's not credible. The US has to therefore do some significant heavy lifting to make Taiwan harder for China to invade. Japan needs to be involved in that effort. I believe this is happening. It would have been more obvious if Michel Flournoy had got the defense job, but I don't really think that there's that much difference between what she would have done and what is being done. And the key here, Demetri, is that means the window of opportunity for Xi Jinping is already beginning to close. That's to say, I doubt that it will get easier for China to take Taiwan by force over the next 4 or let's say 8 years. So that tells you that he's got a fairly limited scope for success here. I think it won't be this year. I think they'll wait until after the Winter Olympics next year. And that will be the time of maximum danger for not only for Taiwan, but for peace in the world at large. My big worry is that when it comes to the crunch, the Biden administration will blink. And the reason I think it will blink is that if this all happens in the year of the midterms, it will so threaten economic stability that the domestic political arguments will prevail over the strategic arguments. That's why in a recent piece I drew an analogy with the Suez Crisis, which really marked the end of Britain's time as a first-rank power. We could have an American Suez Crisis over Taiwan if, in the final analysis, Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan decide that Taiwan just isn't worth losing control of Congress. And that, I think, is the kind of calculation that the Chinese are making, which is why I think next year is the obvious year for them to go for it.
Yeah, well, it's sort of a lose-lose, right? Because that's one scenario. And in the other scenario, if the United States does nothing, it will dramatically undermine.
The right scenario, the good scenario, is that you have sufficient deterrent capability that the Chinese decide that they can't take the risk. It would be risky for them too. The system may not be one of democratic accountability, but clearly if Xi Jinping were to launch an invasion of Taiwan and fail, there would be a profound legitimacy crisis for the regime. So the US can, I think, if it makes the right decisions in the next, let us say, 12 months, significantly raise the cost and the risk to China. But it remains to be seen if we can do that. And it does bring us back to the analogy with 1914. What happened in 1914 was that the Germans felt that time was running out, and if they didn't act sooner rather than later, it would become impossible for them to win a European war. That was the argument that was made again and again in the summer of 1914 for acting. They knew it was risky, but the general staff view was that if you waited any longer, the Russians would sufficiently have concluded their armaments program that Germany would have no chance of winning. If you think about how wars begin, very often it's calculations like that that lead to the risk being taken, the perception that the odds are only going to get worse. And another reason that war happened in 1914 was that the Germans just didn't believe that Britain, that the British Empire, would do it. They thought wrongly that Britain was not that committed to preventing the defeat of France as well as the invasion of Belgium. I think we could find ourselves in that kind of situation. One senses already that Beijing underestimates the United States. There's the view, which has grown since the financial crisis, that the US is kind of over, that it's mucked up the pandemic, and that only confirms the hypothesis.
Which is not even true.
It isn't true. And I think it's led to a misperception in Beijing that the US is kind of past it and China's moment has come. And that's when people make reckless strategic decisions. Underestimating the United States has been a very, very dangerous thing to do historically. But one senses that China is moving in the direction of making that mistake.
Yeah. You mentioned you were sort of alluding to the Schlieffen Plan and the cult of the offensive. For listeners who haven't heard our episode with Bruce Schneier, we discussed the Schlieffen Plan in the context of cyber warfare. I think that was episode 60 or so. You should look for that. So in the interest of time, Niall, let's pivot to talking about the digital yuan. Because I mentioned at the top, you've written so many books. You've written one very popular book called The Ascent of Money, which dealt with the history of money. And you've commented quite a bit and written articles on the digital yuan, China's digital currency. Where does this and the Belt and Road fit into China's larger vision? And what is that vision for regional and possibly global hegemony?
Yes, I wrote about this in a revised edition of The Ascent of Money that came out in 2018 and suggested that it would be quite likely that China would seek to produce a digital currency. I suggested they might call it BitYuan, but they've gone for eCNY or eYuan. So I think that was quite a prescient update to that book. The Chinese have a variety of motives for creating a central bank digital currency. One is simply to limit the power that Chinese tech companies have established in the Chinese financial system. Alipay was getting too big, Ant was getting too big, Tencent was getting too big. So part of the argument here was we've got to do something to preserve the party's control of the financial system. A second and probably less important priority was to increase the appeal of Chinese payments across border so that you could start to see the beginnings of a financial architecture for international payments that the US couldn't control, and through control of it, use sanctions against whomever it likes. I do think that the Chinese see a strategic opportunity in the overuse of financial sanctions by the US, but I don't think that's their paramount objective. The key here, I think, is for the Chinese to increase the number of countries that have to use or are willing to use the Chinese currency. It's not a convertible currency, so it's not going to be anybody's preferred currency unless they are people trying to avoid US sanctions like Iran, or people who would be willing to accept non-convertible yuan because they're already doing so much business with China anyway. And that's where the so-called Belt and Road or One Belt, One Road initiative comes in. China has been building a kind of classic imperial structure of dependence, getting countries to sign up to what turn out to be fairly asymmetric deals that give them access to Chinese finance, Chinese technology, and of course, Chinese forms of coercion. That, I think, is something that we tend to exaggerate the success of because there's so much that's opaque about it. Probably the Chinese have incurred some really stinking bad debts in the process of creating the One Belt, One Road. But does it create a bunch of captive clients who will be willing to hold digital yuan? Yeah, probably it does. So I think that's the way to think about this. The worrying thing for me is not what the Chinese are doing, it's what we're not doing. And it seems to me the United States runs a significant risk of falling behind in financial technology simply because the authorities are so attached to the existing legacy system, because that system allows the US to impose financial sanctions pretty much on anyone it likes, whenever it likes. So I'm not arguing that we should be doing a clone of the digital RMB, but I do think we need a more creative strategy for dealing with Chinese financial technological innovations than we currently have.
Yeah, it's that classic problem, that Microsoft, for example, faced as a corporation in the 90s with Netscape.
Yeah.
And they had just won, they had just dominated the OS market. And here was this upstart with a browser challenging their dominance, and they had to rush to create Internet Explorer. And it's something similar, it seems. I mean, Jay Powell recently said, he was quoted in the Financial Times as saying that there is, quote, no need to rush when it comes to creating a digital dollar. Yeah. And I've been struck by what seems to be, just speaking quite frankly, incompetence and blindness to just how much demand there is in the market for this. I mean, Absolutely. They can look at that plainly in the market capitalization, and you could argue about the valuation models for valuing these different cryptocurrencies and distributed ledgers, but the demand is there overwhelmingly.
I think, the explosion of not only the price of Bitcoin, but of decentralized finance tells you, like a kind of flashing red light on the Fed's dashboard, that there is an appetite for something other than the fiat US dollar. And I think the complacency that Jay Powell has come to personify, it's kind of like the Mad Magazine slogan, what, me worry? Me rush? I mean, the same comes with the fears or non-fears of inflation. Powell is telling us we should just not worry, despite the fact that we're running unprecedented deficits and presiding over spectacular growth of monetary aggregates. We shouldn't worry about that. The dollar will be dominant. The dollar's dominance is so assured that it's almost too dominant. That's the line that has come out of the International Monetary Fund recently. And I think for the historian of the future, it will be deeply perplexing that the United States, which had gained power partly through its financial supremacy, was so complacent about the challenges to that financial supremacy in the early 21st century.
Yeah. Do you think that we are on the cusp of a breakout in consumer and producer prices?
Depends what you mean by a breakout. I mean, I do think that because of short-term variables due to the pandemic, there will be a surge of inflation in the course of this year. How high PCE will go is really hard to say because there are so many imponderables, given the importance of imputed rent in calculating inflation. There could be very transient forces at work. That's the Fed's line. But I think the problem with the Fed line is that there's no obvious reason why inflation expectations should remain well anchored when you have these enormous regime changes. The Fed has changed its inflation framework. It no longer targets an inflation rate, it targets an average. That's a significant change. And the US government, the new administration, keeps telling us that it's a radical regime change in domestic policy that is coming. And if you look at the numbers, the spending in the trillions, it does look like a pretty drastic regime change. What was emergency measures last year in the teeth of the calamity of COVID-19 is in danger of being routinized this year. So why would inflation expectations remain anchored when you're being told that you're both in a monetary regime change and a fiscal regime change? I don't get that. So it's not so much that inflation is going to surge to the levels we saw in the 1970s. Clearly not. But I think that the inflation rate could do something a little bit like it did in the 1960s. In the first half of the 60s, below 2%, nothing going on. Second half of the 60s, two step changes up to 3%, then up to 6% on the back of, number one, Johnson's Great Society program, number two, Vietnam. The lesson of history, which I think is really important to grasp, is that most of the big changes in inflation expectations are war-related. Most, not all, but most. I think if the US combines really, really profligate domestic policies with a geopolitical fail of the sort that we were talking about earlier with respect to Taiwan and China, then there's no way inflation expectations don't take off. If the US can avoid a showdown with China, if the US can get onto some kind of path back to fiscal sobriety, probably in this administration through higher taxes, then maybe you get away with it. But given the scale of the spending that's currently coming down the pike, it's hard to see any immediate prospect of fiscal stabilization. And given the way that US-China relations are developing, it's hard to believe that this will all end amicably.
Yeah. And also given the agenda, given the Green New Deal agenda, given the growing economic inequities in the country, it seems to me that it is absolutely inevitable that the United States government is going to spend. The question is, are we going to do it with a strategic whole-of-government approach? Or are we going to basically continue to do it the way that we have been doing it? And I think that, to me, is the big question. Because if we continue to spend sort of, shooting from the hip as we've been doing, dousing every fire along the way, we're going to find ourselves eventually in a crisis that we can't spend our way out of.
Correct. The problem that I try to identify in Doom is a general one. The federal government is less good at doing stuff than it was in the 1950s. In the 1950s, not only was its pandemic management superior, it was very much better at doing infrastructure than it is today. We have some fundamental pathologies in the public sector of bureaucracy, waste, inefficiency, a penchant for meticulous overregulation rather than resiliency and anti-fragility. And if you take that federal government and say to it, here is limitless money to go save the planet and build green infrastructure, do not be surprised if the results are as dismal as they have been in California. Because remember, the state of California has been running a version of this policy at the state level for years. And I'm still waiting for that high-speed rail link because, of course, none of these things have actually gotten built. On the contrary, the infrastructure of California is in a dire state, as is its education system, as is its criminal justice system, not to mention the fact that the place bursts into flames on an annual basis. So I think when you look at California, you see a disturbing trailer for what the US as a whole could look like if it pursues these indiscriminate policies. It's not that there isn't a role for the state. There clearly is. But we must understand that the competence of the US federal government has deteriorated over the last 30 or so years in ways that should make you very nervous of giving it a blank check, which is effectively what we're doing right now.
Yeah, it's also become much more corrupt. And that is a big part of why we find ourselves here today.
It's a combination of corruption and this sclerotic mindset that produces multiple highly bureaucratic interventions, regulations that cover hundreds of pages. And this has a paralyzing effect. I did a book called The Great Degeneration nearly 10 years ago now, arguing that the administrative state had become an almost paralyzing force. And unfortunately, the 20th century is calling the Biden administration because it wants its economic policy back. We're about to do old school Keynesian style policies, forgetting that the federal government is not the federal government of Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy. It's actually become extraordinarily bad at delivering. So I'm pessimistic about how much is going to be achieved, to say nothing of the fact that pursuing Green New Deals when the Chinese have absolutely no intention of reducing their CO2 emissions seems an utterly futile prospect.
Well, I mean, that's a great example of the complexity of policy. In an increasingly hostile landscape, the Chinese are going to just continue to build coal-fired plants because they're going to have a more difficult time sourcing oil and gas if the United States isn't guarding those sea routes. The mentioning about that was clearly an allusion that you made to Obama's retort to Romney in the 2012 debates about the 1970s are calling for their foreign policy back. But, it's true also in foreign policy, right? I mean, ironically, we find ourselves in a world of great power conflict today.
To give the Biden administration some credit. They haven't scrapped everything that their predecessors did. And in particular, China policy represents quite a clear continuity with the Trump administration. They seem to be junking the Middle East policy, as well, of course, as the Afghanistan policy, but it's not all bad. The trouble is, I think that we can see from the pattern of history how many administrations have come in with bold domestic policies. It goes back to Woodrow Wilson. Democratic presidents elected on domestic platforms of bold progressive reform that end up getting into big wars. It's of course what happened to Roosevelt too. And catching the flu. In the case of Woodrow Wilson, that flu that debilitated him, so damaged his health that he couldn't run for re-election in 1920.
Niall, if I had my way, I'd keep you here for another hour. I could talk with you for another hour for sure, but I know that you have a hard stop, and I want to be respectful of your time. I really appreciate you coming on. This was a lot of fun. This is the first time you and I have ever spoken.
It's true, and I hope we get to do it on something other than Zencastr one day, Demetri, but the return of normal social life is one of the things that we are all looking forward to these days. I've hugely enjoyed the conversation, and it's a pleasure to be part of this really exciting intellectual project that you've launched.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine, and I will definitely be taking you up on that offer. And for everyone else listening, I know that I mentioned a number of previous episodes during this conversation. I'll make sure to include links to those in the related section of this week's episode, which you can find on our website at hiddenforces.io. There's no overtime today, but I have released a premium episode in place of it. It's an absolutely awesome conversation that I recorded this week with my good friend, Grant Williams, where we discussed his most recent newsletter dealing with financial endgame scenarios and the prospects for inflation. Really awesome. Highly recommended. You need access to our premium feed in order to listen to that episode. So if you're not already subscribed, you can do that either through our website or directly through our Patreon page at patreon.com/hiddenforces. Guys, lastly, if today's episode was as interesting and educational for you as it was for me, please take a moment to write a review for Hidden Forces on Apple Podcasts. I cannot emphasize enough what a difference these reviews make to our rankings and our visibility to new listeners. It's also a great and easy way for you to show your love and support for this show. Have a great week, everybody, and see you again next Monday, same time, same place. Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/hiddenforces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.